follow him. That's why we do this, and we're so glad that you're along for the ride. And in a minute, we're going to dig into a brand new series called Living with Lions. We're going to look back in history to the life of a man named Daniel. 2,400 years ago, he was ripped out of his culture, forced to live in a godless and hostile nation, and somehow he maintained his faith in God, his convictions and his integrity, and the people around him respected him, and he gave kindness to them. Somehow, we need this series. You'll see in just a moment just how much we need this series. But before we get into it, right now is a great time for you to check in and let us know you're here. You can text check in to 20022, or you can check in on the LCBC app. And I also want to say, if you're new around here, we just want to send you a gift to say we're glad you tuned in. We want to give some kindness to you. Maybe you haven't been experiencing that in a while from people around you in traffic or at work. We want to send you a gift. If you'll share your address with us, we would love to send that to you to say we're glad you tried something new. And that's it. Let's get the distractions out of the way, and let's dig into a brand new series, Worship and Teaching. Living with Lions from LCBC is coming your way.
Welcome to LCBC. We're so glad you're here today. We're going to spend some time singing out. Would you stand to your feet? We're going to sing out loud to our great God. He's so good. I want to hear you sing. Here we go.
your neighbor or father early in the morning. It will be lastly, we show our trust in God. It's showing God that we trust him by giving a portion of what we make back to him. And I know that's not easy. It's not easy for Rachel and I in our home. And so what we want to do is help you and support you if God's asking you to trust him more in this area of your life. As you take that step, it might just be the nudge that Glenn and Beth both felt too. You know, they heard from Pastor David about our 90-day tithing challenge that simply, if you give to God, a portion of what you make for the next 90 days and let us know, and you feel God wasn't trustworthy to you, we'll give you every penny back, no questions asked. And this really is about trusting God in your life, not about making money at our church. And so you can give it to any church if you want to, if that's your hang up. Just can't give you that money back, right? But I just challenge you, man, take a step and see what Glenn and Beth experienced after they took that step of faith.
When we heard the message from Pastor Dave about the 90-day tithing challenge, we really were at a place where I think we were ready to hear it. We didn't have money really to give.
I was going to say,
extra.
it wasn't because we were in a great financial place at that time.
We weren't. We were trying to pay down debt, but we heard the message, and I really think God spoke and was nudging us very strongly that okay, you guys, you need to give this a try. And we were nervous. I remember looking at each other and we were like, okay, we're going to do this. I would say the transformation from giving to tithing really was more of a heart change for us. I think we looked for God more often in our lives, in the small things, the ways that he was blessing us and providing for us.
Yeah, I think maybe too, some of the bigger decisions that we have gone through in the last couple of years, it made it a little bit easier to step out in faith because we've already stepped out in faith from a tithing perspective. And I think in those situations, it's a little bit easier to put my trust in God.
I hope and pray for those who are considering tithing that they give it a try and see what God really can do in their life, what he reveals, how he reveals himself. I think they might really be really surprised.
That's the question, right? What are you waiting for? Give it a try. Man, if God is urging you to take a step to trust him in the area of your life, why not try the tithing challenge? And so, like Beth said, you might just be surprised by how your faith grows in him. So learn more about the 90-day tithing challenge at the LCBC app or on our website. But today, man, we are starting a brand new series of studies called Living with Lions. So lean in and let's hear from God.
Welcome to week one of what I believe will be an insanely freeing and empowering series. A series that if we lean in, listen, open our hearts, might be the very thing God uses to save us from making some horrible mistakes over the next few months. Like, I am seriously hoping and believing that this series will save your and my Thanksgiving and holidays this year. That this might be what God uses to help us avoid blowing up some conversations that just go sideways, that helps us save a relationship with someone who has totally different views than us. And to be honest, we're doing this series because over the last 2 years, our team has received more emails and questions than easily the previous 10 years combined about how do we live in our circumstances and the conflict that's around us that we're facing personally and publicly and politically. Like, how do we do life well in the middle of everything that's going on around us, how do we do this well? How do we honor God and follow Jesus and not needlessly blow up relationships? How do we honor and follow Jesus when we feel we can't see him in the midst of everything that we're facing personally within our circumstances? How do we honor and follow Jesus when our fears are screaming so loud inside of our heads? They're screaming because we're scared of what's going on around us. When conversations around us seem to be increasingly combative, even just saying, hey, I respectfully disagree seems to start an argument. Hopefully over the next few weeks, God will truly move and speak to each of us in such a personal way that families are restored, workplaces are healed, and most importantly, people can discover Jesus and his profound love for them. Because figuring all of this out is such a big topic and it's so vital. We actually went looking for a guide and we found one in the Old Testament in a guy named Daniel. And I know that many of you guys feel like you've heard the story of Daniel. He's one of the most famous characters in the Old Testament. And many of us think we know his story, but few of us actually know all the details and nitty gritty of what he was facing. I mean, many of us have heard of Daniel in the lion's den. And we assume that the entire book, the entire point of Daniel's life is that if we do the right things and have enough faith, then that means God will then deliver us too from our own lions. Well, we have been gleaning a ton from Larry Osborne's book, Thriving in Babylon. It's an awesome book, and I've just learned a ton from it. And I love how Larry sets up Daniel and our understanding of him. This is how he sets up. He says it is a huge mistake to turn Daniel, the book of Daniel, into an adventure story. It not only obscures the main point, but also sends a blatantly false message. It says, if we do the right thing, God won't let bad things happen to us. He'll rescue us from the furnace and the lions. He said that is not the main point of the book of Daniel. In fact, the main point of Daniel is that Daniel found a way in a culture far more wicked than anything we face to glorify and serve God with such integrity and power that kings and peasants, an entire nation, turn to acknowledge the splendor of a living God. That's the point of Daniel, and that's the life that we want. And we want to ask if our life can have that same kind of impact. So I'm excited for us to get to know our guide, Daniel. So I want to invite you guys right now to open up your Bible to Daniel chapter 1. That's going to be page 667 if you're in one of our rooms and you're using a Bible in our seats. Open up to chapter 1 on page 667. And I want you to stay open to it because we're going to live through the first couple of chapters the entire time today. So go ahead, open up, and we're going to jump right into verse 1 of chapter 1 of Daniel on page 667 in our Bible. So getting us jumping in right out of the gate, verse 1 says, during the third year of King, now I just got to take a quick time out. There are some really big names in here, and I have done my best to figure out how to pronounce all of these. If any of you are Hebrew scholars and you know the absolute correct way to say these, I'm just gonna go ahead and apologize. I'm a southern redneck from Georgia. I don't know how to pronounce some of these names. I'm doing my best, people. During the third year of King Jehoiakim's reign of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. All right, let's get some backstory of what's going on in the history of Israel, that they're now getting attacked by King Nebuchadnezzar. Now I'm going to jump us all the way back to Moses. Some of you guys have heard the story of Moses fleeing the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. You might have heard the story of the plagues and the parting of the Red Sea and wandering around the desert for 4 years and leading them into what is called the Promised Land. Now, the Promised Land was the land promised as they're coming out of Egypt. It's the promise that God said, hey, if you follow me, I'll take you there. So they eventually get there. The nation starts to grow. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it eventually gets kings. And the first king they have is Saul, and he's sort of okay. Then the next king is David. And David's a lot better. Now, David's not perfect by any means, but David does a pretty good job. And then after David, his son Solomon takes over. And Solomon is heralded as one of the wisest men who ever lived. He actually writes all the Proverbs, most of the Proverbs that we've been reading over the last month. And if you joined us for our series, Foolproof, he was the author of many of those texts that we are looking at. Solomon writes a ton of incredible wisdom. He builds a ton of incredible things. But Solomon also gets a ton of wives, like almost 1,000 when it's all said and done. Like the guy liked wives for some reason. He gets super distracted by the ladies towards the end of his life. And because of this, he actually doesn't set up his son really well to take over. So when his son takes over the kingdom almost immediately splits into civil war. The northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And these two kingdoms were this is where Israel's history gets crazy. The northern and southern kingdom are almost always have tension between the two. They're almost always in conflict. And there would be seasons that one of these kingdoms would follow the ways of God. And then there'd be other seasons that they would do awful. Seasons of turning to God, then seasons that they would turn to pagan worship. And both nations would have these moments that they would turn to worshiping all these different false gods. Like they had this one God they'd worship, the God of Baal. You might hear some stories of that as you read through the Old Testament. And worse yet, there would be even seasons that they would turn to this one God called Moloch, and they would actually practice child sacrifice to this pagan God called Moloch. And just to kind of paint a picture of how horrible this is, Moloch had bronze hands that they would heat up till it was glowing, and then they would offer their children onto those bronze hands. And Israel had some really dark days. The kingdom of Judah and Israel, they had dark days in these seasons, moments that they would be turning to God, the moments that they wouldn't. And so God would send prophets to tell these folks to knock it off, to stop that nonsense and to return to him. And they would have seasons that they would. And then they would have seasons that they wouldn't. And this is where in this back and forth, we start to see some of the character, some of the attributes of God. See, all of us, including Israel and Judah, stand between two attributes of God. On one side is God's grace, and on the other is God's mercy. And grace is him giving us what we don't deserve, and like love and forgiveness and blessing. And mercy is holding back what we do deserve, holding back punishment from things that we've done wrong, retaliation from those that we've hurt accidentally or on purpose, the full consequences of our mistakes. And there's times that God's mercy is protecting us in ways that we're clueless to, ways that we can easily take for granted. So all of us live between God's grace, giving us what we don't deserve, and God's mercy, holding back what we do deserve. Grace giving us what we don't deserve, and mercy holding back what we do. Well, Israel's a tiny nation. And it's in between giant, strong nations. And God, in his mercy, had held back these other nations. And he had kept Israel out of their attention. He shielded them from the natural dog-eat-dog world of warlords and destruction. But God, he kept warning Israel, he kept warning Judah that time and time again to knock it off with the child sacrifices, to knock it off with the pagan practices, to knock it off with how they were treating each other. And they didn't knock it off. They kept repeating it. And finally, God goes, hey, if you don't want my grace, if you don't want my mercy, fine. I know where I'm not wanted. And he kind of pulls back his hands. And he kind of let just the natural course of warlords and destruction run its course. And Assyria swoops in 722 and conquers the northern kingdom. A ton of people are killed. Destruction is everywhere. A ton is taken captives. And that straightens up the southern kingdom. For about 140 years, they kind of had their act together, but old habits die hard. And finally, God just goes, hey, if you don't want to follow me, if you don't want my mercy and grace, then cool, I'll pull my hands back. But this time it wasn't the Assyrians coming. It was actually the nation that would become known as the symbol of an evil and wicked nation. It was the nation of the Babylonians. So we read in verse 1. During the third year of King Jehoiakim's reign of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon comes to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred items from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. This is where we start to see just how bad things are for Daniel and what he's living through. There's another book in the Bible called 2 Kings, and 2 Kings is an amazing history book that kind of tells us of what happened. And in 2 Kings chapter 25, we actually read the history of this attack and of King Nebuchadnezzar coming in. And we're told that Nebuchadnezzar's siege lasted a year and a half. And in that time, all the food in the city dried up. His army would encircle the city and wait for the people inside the city, trapped inside the city, to starve to death, to go crazy in the tension, to wane away and not be able to fight. The city was wasting away while the invading army camped outside, partying and feasting, just waiting to pounce. Guys, I had a chance a couple of years ago to actually walk the walls of Jerusalem, and it's not a big city. It's not huge, and you can see all around it, and the streets are close and narrow, and everyone in this moment, when they saw the Babylonians coming in, they would have fled into the protective walls of the city, and inside the city, man, it would have been a sweatbox of anxiety and stress and fear and paranoia of everyone just waiting for the moment that the walls would finally break and death would flood in. I mean, can you even imagine Daniel and the nation, what they were going through? 18 months of slowly waning away. So finally, after 18 months, the remaining soldiers, almost too weak to even fight, they break down, the ramps are pushed against the wall, and the Babylonians flood into the city, and a massacre starts. And now just listen to how cruel King Nebuchadnezzar is. His forces, he forces the defeated, broken, famished, starved king, after all of this, to watch. He pulled him out of the city in front of everyone, and he forced him to watch his sons be slaughtered right in front of him. And then right after he killed his sons, he gouged his eyes out. So that would be the last thing he would ever see. He then, taking the blinded, broken, famished king, and he bound him like a dog, and he drug him to Babylon to beg till the day he died. Guys, I want you to get this picture. King Nebuchadnezzar was ruthless, and the nation was experiencing something awful. This guy's actually so crazy that we read a story about him later in the book of Daniel, that he would at one point construct a 90-foot statue of himself. And he would give a signal that whenever the signal was played, everyone who heard it had to bow down and worship with no questions asked. Basically, if you didn't bow down, you didn't have a head. This guy killed indiscriminately. He just killed for sport. He invaded and destroyed the city. And this is the guy of those who barely survived must now fear. And on top of that, to add insult to injury, after breaking them physically, he breaks the spirit of the nation. And he goes into their most sacred place, their holy of holies in the temple, and he takes items out of the temple as mockery to their God. And he takes them not only out of the temple, but he takes them back to his God, his demonic God named Marduk. And this was publicly to mock Israel, publicly calling them out as weak and defeated. Like there's nothing in our nation that I could think of that would carry the symbolism of what he did in that gesture. I mean, it would be like the U.S. getting defeated in battle, destroyed in battle, and then the invader going and taking our Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, all our flags, gathering up all of our bald eagles, the Yankees, the Cowboys, the 96 Chicago Bulls, the 90 Braves, because everybody knows those are the best teams ever, and your mama's apple pie, and taking them back to his house. I mean, it was like beyond insulting and depressing with what Daniel was feeling in this moment. The insult of what King Nebuchadnezzar did, it was profound. It was crushing. He had broken their bodies, but now those who were still alive, he was crushing their spirit. And after all of this, it continues. And we read in verse 3, then the king ordered the chief of staff, I have no clue how to pronounce this, guys. I have no clue, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking men, he said. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning, and are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. So we've learned a little bit about what was going on in Daniel's life, and now we get to start to learn a little bit about who Daniel was. See, we are discovering in this moment that Daniel was either part of the royal family or he was a noble family. Daniel was a part of the who's who of Jerusalem. He was one of the rich kids who lived in the fancy homes and went to the nice school while all the other boys went and worked the fields. Also, notice at this time that he's still alive. Like the poorest in the city, they would have starved first. The lowest would have been the first to die on the front lines. And I'm not knocking Daniel for his place in life. He didn't choose the home he was born into. He didn't pick it. But what I want to highlight here is that Daniel is experiencing an extreme whiplash. I mean, he's going from being somebody to a nobody, from having it all to having nothing, from privilege to prisoner. What's happening to Daniel on a personal level is beyond traumatic. I mean, he somehow survives 18 months of a city in meltdown and then is now picked for the king's service. And he's being forced, get this, to learn. He is being forced, he's to train the young men in the language and literature of Babylon. Guys, the language and literature of Babylon, that's the occult. That's witchcraft. The state religion of Babylon was satanic. And he is now being forced into a rigorous 3-year program of learning astrology, the language and literature of the Chaldeans, which is to certify him as an enchanter and a magician and an expert in the occult. He's being forced to learn something so contrary to who he is as an Israelite. Guys, Daniel, he had it awful. His new culture was wicked and evil. And just to fully remind Daniel that his old life was gone, King Nebuchadnezzar had one more thing, one more insult to injury, a name change. Listen to this. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen from the tribe of Israel. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach. Azariah was called Abednego. After all of that, one last insult, ripping off of their family identity, their cultural identity, their Hebrew names were gone. And just to add insult to all of this, Daniel's name, it means God is my judge. But his Babylonian name, what his captors changed it to, Belteshazzar, means Bel's prince. And Bel was a title for Marduk, their demonic god that they worship. So it would be like having your name changed from Christian to Satan's son, Satan's prince. This was Babylon's way of forcing these captives to not only adopt new identities, but to adopt a new God. So here's what we've learned about Daniel's situation so far. His home is destroyed. His family is more than likely murdered. Everything that once defined him is gone. The king he's now a slave to, is ruthless, murderous, unreasonable, and cruel beyond measure. I mean, there is trauma everywhere. I mean, if you read the story, there's social trauma and cultural trauma and physical trauma and emotional trauma and spiritual trauma. Literally everything imaginable has been stripped from Daniel. And there's actually one more trauma that's not explicitly said in the Bible, but when you look at all the evidence, it's almost impossible to not assume it was there, that it happened. And that was the addition of sexual trauma. I mean, have you guys ever been reading through the New Testament? Have you ever noticed those long lists of who begat who, the genealogies that as you read through, you're just like, oh my goodness, why are there all these names here? What are they getting at? Larry Osborne, in his book, he actually highlights this. And he says, when it comes to Daniel and his friends, there is absolutely no mention of any spouse or family in the entire book or the rest of Scripture. In a Jewish context, such silence is deafening. Add to the fact that powerful kings of antiquity routinely took the best and brightest from conquered lands and brought them home. The best women were enrolled into the king's harem. The best men were placed into his service as high-level stewards and slaves. And now, obviously, these are not the kind of men a king won't hanging around his harem. So he ultimately, so to eliminate any problems and to remove any chance of a testosterone-driven rebellion, kings routinely had such men emasculated, turned into eunuchs. In fact, the man in charge of Daniel's training was himself a eunuch, the chief of eunuchs. And we debated, do we describe what a eunuch is? If you got kids, I'll let you figure out what to say to them. If you don't know, just look to the guy sweating. He'll probably be able to tell you what it means. Like, this was horrible. So literally, almost everything that defined Daniel, that gave him value and place, is gone. His country burned to the ground. His family more than likely murdered. His faith destroyed and publicly mocked as weak and incapable. His masculinity taken. Daniel was experiencing a combative culture and circumstances to his core. Experiences beyond our wildest imaginations. Every conviction was being challenged and threatened. Every hope and dream crushed. And my hope is that over the next few weeks, that we get to learn lessons from him on how he lived in a culture and circumstance that was so extreme. But today, I want to walk away with two cornerstones of how I believe Daniel was able to build a life in captivity under this type of pressure. And I hope by us looking at these two cornerstones, all of us can start to build a life that can handle those types of situations, no matter what life throws at us. So the first one is found in verse 1. In verse 1, we read, during the third year of King Jehoiakim's reign of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him. The Lord gave him victory and permitted him. Daniel is writing this. Daniel is writing this from captivity, and Daniel is saying, the Lord gave him. The Lord permitted. Guys, when the Lord is behind everything, it changes how we see everything. When the Lord is behind everything, it changes everything. Daniel had an understanding and acceptance of God's sovereignty that is simply mind-blowing to me. He somehow or another remembered in the midst of all of his pain and chaos and trauma that God was still in control. When it didn't feel like God was in control, he somehow or another knew God was still in control. When it felt like evil had won, that God was being mocked and people were being hurt, he somehow or another knew God was still in control. When Daniel's personal life was falling apart, his health was failing, faith was being ridiculed and mocked, he somehow or another remembered God was in control. Guys, it changes everything when we know that God is behind everything. It changes everything when we know that God is behind everything. So can you trust that God's in control? Can you trust that God's in control so you don't have to win every argument? So you don't have to have your way every time? Can you surrender that you don't have to be in control? That some things are outside of our grasp, our understanding, our likings, and no matter how much we hate what is happening, disagree with what's happening or being done, want to kick and scream and declare, not on my watch, God's still in control. I mean, if I'm honest, this one is really hard for me. I had this really weird season in my life about 6 years ago where within 6 months, I was at 3 mass graves. I was at Auschwitz in Poland, the killing fields of Cambodia, and then I was outside of Port-au-Prince in the mass grave from the earthquake. It was a really weird season. And I saw things during that time that I should have never seen. I saw things that the world should have never seen. And when I see those things, it's hard for me to accept that God's always in control, especially when stuff like that's happening. Over the years as a pastor, I've officiated funerals for kids. Personally, I've watched loved ones die from really, really dumb diseases. I've sat and cried with victims. And I've had enough of that. I don't know about you, but I don't need to do anymore. But God's in control. And when the Lord is behind everything, it changes everything. I've got to start with this cornerstone. If I want to build a life that can weather any storm, any circumstance, any combative culture, anything that's coming around me, if I want to be able to weather that with dignity and grace and honor Jesus, I got to come back to the simple truth that God's in control. God's in control. I mean, I would love to never bury another kid. I'd love to never see illness come into another person's life. I would love to never sit with someone who's been hurt. But until that day comes, while those things are still happening, can I believe in the midst of all of that, in the midst of the storms that rage around us, that God is still in control? Because when the Lord is behind everything, it changes everything. God is in control, so we can trust. God is in control, so we can hope and rest and accept. God is in control, so we don't have to fight to be in control. And I know this says easy but lives hard. But guys, no matter what you're facing or feeling or fearing, no matter what is going on in your life right now, God is in control. And when the Lord is behind everything, it changes everything. Second cornerstone that I believe we learn from Daniel that we can build our life upon if we want to be able to weather no matter what culture and circumstances bring us. We actually find it in verse 6. And I want you to listen to how Daniel writes this. Daniel describes this. He says, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were the four of the young men chosen. Chosen. I mean, that's a powerful word. And if I was to write this, if it was my story to tell, I don't think I would have used the word chosen. I would have used the word forced, threatened, required, punished. I mean, chosen's like way too positive for me. Chosen is what you do when you're a kid and you're playing Red Rover. Chosen is what happens when you make varsity. Chosen is what happens when you get asked out on the date. Chosen is when you get the job. Chosen is not the word you use when you're forced into a 3-year education of the occult under the scrutiny of a madman. And this is the second cornerstone. The second cornerstone that we can build our life around that we learn from Daniel is that we don't choose to be chosen, but we choose what we do when we're chosen. We don't choose to be chosen, but we do choose what we do when we're chosen. We didn't choose to have family members with wildly different beliefs. We didn't choose to have families in our school district pushing an agenda that you deeply fear. We didn't choose to have coworkers who endorse things that disturb you, that break your heart. We didn't choose to have conflict in our lives. None of us are saying, I want more people to disagree with my convictions in life. I mean, none of us are saying, hey, sign me up for more drama and pain, please. Like, we don't choose to be chosen, but we choose what we do when we're chosen. And here's the thing that I want, and I beg everyone who will ever listen to this, whether it is live right now or while you're watching in the archives on the website, I beg that I want you to have convictions. I want you to know what you believe. I want you to root your convictions deeply in what it means to follow Jesus the best way. And I am begging you to not just have convictions like Jesus, but I am begging you to also have a posture like Jesus, a posture like Jesus. Jesus who said, we will be known by our love of one another, not the words we shout at one another. Jesus who said the greatest among us is the one who serves everyone among us. The way of Jesus is not shouting our convictions. It's recognizing that we have been chosen for such a time as this, chosen for such a relationship as this, chosen for a community such as this, chosen to live like Jesus in the midst of this, chosen for the circumstances we find ourselves in. When you're chosen to be near someone you disagree with, our first thought can't be, I gotta defend my beliefs. It's gotta be, I gotta live my beliefs. My beliefs are not talking points, they're living points. When life throws circumstances that take your breath away, instead of shouting and complaining, but being able to say, Jesus, I want to follow you in the midst of this storm. That's why Jesus said they will know us by our love. That those around us should honestly experience more love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness and self-control, no matter what is going on around us. Can we believe, no matter how crazy life and culture and circumstances get, no matter how angry others get, and no matter what your circumstances are shouting at you, can we believe that God is still in control? And when the Lord is in control, it changes everything. It changes everything. And we can choose in the midst of that to still love like Jesus, serve like Jesus, be humble like Jesus, be kind like Jesus. Man, we've got to learn from Daniel. And remember that when the Lord is in control of everything, it changes everything. And that though we didn't choose to be chosen, we didn't choose life to treat us this way, we do choose what we do when we're chosen. And we can always choose to love and serve like Jesus. Guys, when I was a kid, we used to sing this old hymn. We used to sing that old hymn, I Surrender All. Does anybody remember that hymn? Anybody sing that as a kid growing up? Man, we sung that so much as a kid that there's moments that the words just kind of became lost to me. But every now and then, since then, as life kind of picks up, God brings those words back to me. Whenever I'm wanting to fight something, argue about something, be combative around something, defend something, whenever I'm terrified about something, whenever I can't believe the situation that I'm in, God just brings that back to me. And I kind of find myself taking a deep breath and just being like, all right, God, I surrender all. I surrender. I trust. I trust that you got this. I trust you're in control. So I can surrender. And I want to invite everyone right now to stand up. So I want everyone to stand up, whether you're at a campus, whether you're at your home. I want you to go ahead and stand up. And I also want to invite you to take your hands. And I want you to put your hands in front of you. And with your hands in front of you, I want you to clench your fist as hard as you can. And I want you to flex your forearms and flex your biceps. And I want you to flex. And as you're thinking and clenching, I want you to think about that thing right now that you want to fight. That person that you want to stand up to because they are different than you and believe different than you. I want you to think about that person that you're just waiting to cancel because their views and your views are two very different views. I want you to think about that political agenda that you hear is coming, and it brings so much fear into your heart, and it makes your hair stand up and your heart race. I want you to think about that. I want you to clench your fists, and I want you to think about that person that you want to avoid with everything in you because you hate how they talk, and you hate how they push, and you hate how they make you feel so different than them. And I want you to think about that situation you're in. The circumstance that you did not choose, you did not ask for it, you did not want it, you did not invite it, but it is your storm and you're in the middle of it. And I want you to think about the fear it causes and the worries that linger and the anxiety that sneaks in at night. And I want you to think about all of that. And I want you to clench your fist and I want you to squeeze it tight. I want you to feel it. And then I want to ask you, for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of being the hands and feet of Jesus, for the sake of being known by our love and not our opinions and fears, for the sake of holding Jesus and not our problems, can you surrender? Can you surrender that to Jesus? And can you say with hands open, God, I feel out of control, but I surrender control to you. God, I fear being taken advantage of, but I surrender to your plan. God, I fear the future, but I surrender to your care. God, if I'm honest, I don't know if this loving others thing really works. And if sacrificing and serving others actually matters. I don't know if service is the best way. I don't know if serving's better than shouting. I don't know if I believe that your way is always the best way. But today I want to do my best. And I'm going to surrender all to you. Because I'm choosing to trust that your ways are the best ways. And so as we sing, I surrender all, what might God be asking you to surrender? To surrender so that someone who might feel like they're fighting you right now might start to feel loved by you. That someone who's watching you in the midst of your storm might be inspired by you. And because of all of that, that people might experience the life-changing love of Jesus. Guys, when we believe and know that God is behind everything, it changes everything. And when we remember that we didn't choose to be chosen, but we choose what we do when we are chosen, God steps in a profound way. He can work through your life. And who knows? Maybe kings and peasants and a nation will see Jesus in us the way they saw Jesus in Daniel. Let's pray. Jesus, it is terrifying to say, I surrender all. But God, I know that when we truly believe that you're behind everything, it changes everything. And that whenever we choose, that we know that we didn't choose to be chosen, but we choose how we behave when we're chosen, that we can trust you, we can trust your plans, we can trust your sovereignty, and we can rest in you. Jesus, I pray today that you help us surrender our fears, our control, our worries, our anxieties, and rest in you. And because we rest in you, get to be your hands and feet to a world that desperately needs to know that you are God and you are love and you are here. Jesus, we love you, we thank you, and we trust you. And to the best of our ability, we surrender all to you. It's in your name. Amen.
Oh, to Jesus I
like there's a way to put those prayer requests there. It would be an honor to pray with you as you learn and surrender daily to Jesus all the fears and worries that sneak in. But please surrender whatever it is you have to surrender. So we are known by our love, not our convictions, known by our service, not our arguments, known as lives being changed by Christ. Because believe it or not, the first followers of Jesus, in a culture and in circumstances that hated and killed them, God used that type of surrender to rock the world, to topple empires, and to reshape the face of the globe. And who knows? Maybe he'll use us to do it again. But until then, LCBC, may the Lord bless and protect you. May the Lord smile on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord show you his favor and give you his peace. Thanks for being here. We love you guys, and we'll see you all next week as we continue learning from Daniel and how to thrive under pressure.